Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
So what exactly is the state of our Detroit region as we head into 2020? It's important to look at, as regardless of what angry people on the internet might think, our region is economically and culturally connected. Most Metro Detroiters live in one county or city and work in another. We all use the same infrastructure to commute, to visit family, to shop, and so much more. And I know from personal experience that in the eyes of the world, we compete on one Detroit team, even though proponents of our long-standing internal divisions might try to tell you otherwise. The fact is, we're in this together. So the Detroit Regional Chamber does an annual State of the Region report. For the 2019 edition, we poured through about 50 pages across 3 documents and pulled out what we think were important highlights along with our thoughts. Me and Sven Gustafson quickly realized that if it were a dashboard on a car, we have some key warning lights blinking that we need to pay attention to, as well as some positives. Now, normally here on Daily Detroit, we talk about the Tri-County for the most part, of Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne, but these kind of economic reports cover the much larger area that's 5.4 million people. It goes all the way to Ann Arbor.
Port Huron, Shiawassee County, way down Lenawee County.
Lenawee, I don't know. Lenawee, yeah.
Spelled Lenawee. Yeah,
right. 7,000 square miles is what we're talking about here. So it's huge.
Big geographic spread.
Right. And so these numbers give us a great snapshot of what's happening across our region. Because let's face it, despite what some critics might say, we are all economically tied one way or another, from the city to the suburbs, back and forth. Without each other, we don't have really any economic power. And so it's important to look at this in a high level. We also have some interesting drill downs when it comes to the city and the region that we'll get into. But Sven, man, this was 3 documents. As I said, we're going to link to them on the website. But this is a lot to go through.
Yeah, for sure. But lots of really fascinating information here, all about economic competitiveness, educational attainment, and we'll get to that separately later. But lots of stuff to drill down and kind of sink your teeth into there. But yeah, lots of stuff to really make you think and to keep the analysts busy, so to say.
Well, and I think a big high-level takeaway for me is that there's progress in a lot of areas. However, I feel like in statistic after statistic, and we'll get into this, we're making progress, but we're not keeping up with national averages. And that really worries me from a future point of view.
For sure. I mean, we were just talking about overall population growth over the last 5 years, as measured between 2014 and 2018. The entire Detroit region, all 11 counties, up by, a fraction of a percent.
Yeah, 0.3%.
Yeah, which is basically flat, and it's well below the national growth rate average, right?
Which was 2.8%, so nearly 3%.
Correct. And we're trailing badly behind, fast-growing cities like Dallas, Seattle, Atlanta, and even Minneapolis. I mean, another, super cold, upper Midwest city.
Yeah, it's definitely
with
not
long winters.
Yeah, the weather is not the problem. You can look at this a couple of ways, and all of these numbers. You can look at it as these are a challenge we need to work through, and I think that's the case regardless, but also opportunity. Like all the time when I think about Detroit and the Detroit region, I feel like we have so much opportunity that we could unlock here, and yet for some reason we just keep not doing it. Another number that kind of proves this point is regionally our per capita income. So not our household income. I'm talking about per capita, like what each person earns, is up 2.5% as a region over the last few years. But the nation has gone up 4.4%. So like almost double income growth for the rest of the nation on average, and compared to what we are. So we're still, although yes, our incomes are growing a little bit, we're not keeping up with the rest of the nation. And that puts us at, like about $33,733.
Yeah. And I mean, this is in a, overall climate where incomes have been struggling for decades, right, to keep up with the cost of living. I mean, the incomes have basically been flat since I think like the 70s when adjusted for inflation.
And that's nationally, yeah.
Right. So it's not like individual workers in this country have been, doing gangbusters. They've not. They've been struggling. I mean, this has been well documented. The middle class is struggling more and more to keep up with the costs of living, right? They're struggling to pay the bills.
I look at this and go, when you talk about struggling to pay the bills, one of the things is educational attainment. And there's some things that we really need to look at with that. And not only do we have kind of like a lower number of people like going to college than we really, I think, should, especially in the city of Detroit.
Yeah.
We have some critical issues with the lack of people going to college there.
Huge disparities between the overall region and the city of Detroit when you break it out. So I was looking at that. This is the State of Education, which is the first ever report of its kind from the Detroit Regional Chamber. They partnered with the University of Michigan Youth Policy Lab for this first ever, it's an inaugural report, really. And they're pretty stark and clear in their kind of like summary at the very beginning. They write, now I'll read it exactly as it's worded. The Detroit region must make post-secondary education attainment a top priority. Businesses indicate the number one issue they face is attracting and retaining talent. And they go on a little later to say education in the state is in crisis and students must be the top priority. Their goal is an ambitious one. They want to increase post-secondary educational attainment.
And that means going to college.
Well, it means going to college, but it also means
completing it.
So either getting a 2-year associate's degree or some kind of, certificate or something like that, or a traditional 4-year bachelor's degree. They want to increase that to 60% by 2030. That's a little over 10 years away from now. Currently, the Detroit region's at just a little over 40%. So that's a big.
I think it's kind
target.
to call that ambitious. It's kind to call that ambitious.
Kind to call that ambitious. I think especially considering kind of who we are and the makeup and just sort of our collective DNA in this region. I mean, we're a blue collar working class region.
Well, and remember that these numbers include Ann Arbor, and that has been an economic engine.
Which has been a huge boot. I mean, we were talking about what
times over there.
We were talking earlier about what this report, all these reports would look like if you stripped out Ann Arbor. It would be
bleak.
Yeah.
Straight up bleak, because Ann Arbor is a beast of an economic engine. It's one of the few areas that's truly growing, like nationally competitive in the state.
For sure. So that 40% statistic of education attainment that I cited, that puts us behind cities like Boston, Minneapolis, Seattle, Atlanta, and Chicago. But it also even puts us behind, similar Rust Belt cities like St. Louis and Cleveland even. And it's behind the national rate as well, for sure.
So dovetailing with what you were saying about needing post-secondary education, there's a few numbers here I want to walk through that I think are really key. About half of our folks are not making it through post-secondary education once they get there. So they're getting there and they're not making it through. I believe it's what?
They're failing to get a degree.
Yeah, they're failing to get a degree after 6 years. So they're getting somewhat in there, but they're not making it all the way through. That tells me that we need more supports. There's something happening where stuff isn't completing. And here's, I think, a number that points to it. You go farther, 36%, so a little bit more than a third of regional students are
high school graduates.
High school graduates are considered ready for going to college.
Right. That's based on their SAT or ACT test scores.
So our school districts across the region, and do not look at just Detroit has its own issues, and we're going to get into it in a second. But across the region, our school districts are failing our students big time, because if only about a little bit more than a third of them are ready to go to college or any post-secondary, and I'm talking about, that talks about certificate programs, all that stuff, those people are lost in the new economy. They have no place in the new economy.
Well, and I think I don't want to go too deep into this rabbit hole, but we always blame school districts, and sometimes rightly so. But I think it's also a cultural thing that we ourselves, like as residents of this region, we don't value education.
Well, we're not factory.
Parents are not instilling education values in their children sufficiently. I mean, I see it, I've got 2 kids in school. I see it. My wife works in the school. She's studying right now to become a teacher, to get her certification. And she sees the same things. Kids just are sent to school. They're just not ready to learn. They have not come from a background that has made them receptive and, open to learning. That's a huge problem.
And in the city of Detroit, it's even greater. It's less than 10% of students. I don't know where you fit in the modern world if you're not ready for, and again, this isn't just counting college. This is all post-secondary education. This means, getting certificate programs. This means learning trades. We are not preparing our kids. And this is a red alert crisis in my little opinion.
Yeah. And you're going to be talking with Ron French later or this morning, I think, about some of these problems, right?
Yeah, I will be. I think that'll be on a show like
Ron French from Bridge Magazine.
Yep. Either it'll be on a show tomorrow or the next day, but it's not an issue. It's an issue that we're not going to let go of here at Daily Detroit. I know that
it's a huge, I mean, it underlies so many other issues. Like there is probably nothing more important as a local issue anyway, I would say, than education. Because if we can't fix education, like there's not much hope, in my opinion.
Well, and then once we educate them, we got to get them to stay. So I think people need to remember that millennials are no longer the immediate post-college generation. Things have, time has passed.
No, they're a prime advertising demographic now at this point.
Hi, millennial listeners. But
25 to 34-year-old. That is who you want to target, man. They might not have any money, but you still want to target them, right?
Right. And
but to your point, though, I did want to throw this one out because this is interesting. One of the things we constantly hear about in this region is that like we need to do a better job of retaining the college graduates who go to school here, go to college here in Michigan. This report found that in 2017, 36%, so more than a third of college graduates educated here in Michigan left the state within a year of graduating. We got to chip away.
We're still not. Basically, what that's saying is we're still not fixing the brain drain.
Well, and we have to ask ourselves why. Like, why is this not an attractive place for college graduates? Like, the job opportunities not.
I mean,
here,
to me, it's obvious.
Quality of life.
To me, it's obvious. Like I talk to listeners. I used to work in the staffing business, like in my corporate life. Like it's blatantly obvious, but our leaders just don't want to do it.
We need more surface parking lots.
All the surface parking lots.
I mean, come on.
Right. That is
so
the way
obvious.
to our success. We're just going to pave the entire thing over. We've talked about education a bit, but I want to specifically talk about business. This is something that we cover a lot on the podcast. It's important to look at the sectors that we've got going on here, looking at like what is the reality of our unemployment picture and about construction as well, because there's some other things I wanted to call out. One of the things is that regional unemployment actually has ticked up for the first time since 2009, which is recession time. Now, we got knocked doubly hard by the recession, more so than the rest of the country. We had already
been in recession for many years.
Right. We are now just getting back to pre-recession-ish levels. We're not like going up, and then we're already starting to see a unemployment tick up. That's really concerning.
Well, in Detroit, traditionally, we go into recession before the rest of the country. We're like an early harbinger, and we come out earlier than the rest of the country, which is kind of a tick of the auto industry. It's kind of it's always sort of the leading edge of any kind of downturn.
Well, and the auto industry, when it comes to publicly traded companies, is still the number one thing that drives our region. And in their list that they don't have FCA because of the way it's listed or something like that. But it's still, the big three.
Yeah.
That's what drive things. And then when you look at the other companies, it's automotive suppliers, it's logistics, and then you've got some things like healthcare. Some of the fastest growing segments include healthcare and social assistance. Why? Because our population is aging like crazy.
Yep.
Because we're not keeping those young people. So our average population is going up.
Healthcare is approaching 1/5 of the U.S. economy.
And think about that. Think about the amount of change that's going to happen, especially if you think about the trends towards what if we did single payer? What happens when you publicize 1/5 of the economy?
Yeah.
There's going to be so many economic fallouts. I'm not saying one side or the other. I'm saying the repercussions of whatever is done is going to be gigantic.
Healthcare in United States, healthcare is sort of like the ultimate too big to fail. It's like a sector that is too big to fail, literally. I mean, nobody calls it that, but it is. I mean, there are parts of it for sure that probably need to be like, burn it down and start over. But it is, like, to your point, like you can't make big sweeping changes without major fallout because of just how big the sector is.
And it's up to people's decision if that fallout's worth it.
Yeah.
But I think we all need to realize there's going to be some short-term pain for sure.
For sure.
And manufacturing's still a big thing in this region. We still have not diversified from that. And then the final thing I really want to point out as far as like growth is the lack of it in construction permits.
Yeah, that's interesting too. But I would also point out, this is a good segue. Some of the fastest growing occupations are interesting. Transportation and material moving, so you're talking about logistics, architecture, which I thought was really interesting, engineering, computer and math related occupations, all of those sectors grew more than 14% over the past 5 years. That's a good thing. STEM occupations, so science, technology, engineering, math, those kind of jobs grew more than 10% over that 5-year period. That's on par with the national growth rate. And we're seeing more skilled workers in the region, growth of more than 7% over those 5 years. So that's a good thing. I mean, we've been talking about some like big, heavy challenges. I think let's let our listeners down easily here and sort of highlight some of the more encouraging, I guess, results from some of these studies. I'll start off. We talked about the automotive industry and everything. Regional transit actually was some interesting findings here.
Yeah, numbers are up.
Numbers are indeed up 0.6% in 2018. That puts us as one of the few metropolitan regions that actually saw growth, and including growth in bus ridership, which was up almost 240,000 rides in 2018.
But don't you know no one rides the bus? Don't you know they're always empty? Don't you know?
Buses are outmoded technology, and we should just give everyone Uber and Lyft certificates. I mean, which is exactly the argument that opponents are currently making. As Uber
on the and latest continue to lose money like crazy.
Yeah, well, right. And I mean, hello, have you ever, how is a minimum wage worker supposed to afford Uber and Lyft rides? I mean, I can't afford Uber and Lyft rides all the time. I mean, I do it sometimes, but I don't do them willy-nilly because those things are expensive.
Oh, yeah. Well, and another positive thing is that millennial population is actually up almost 11%, and that's outpacing the national average, which I thought was really interesting. I also think that could be in part a factor of including so much of the region or so much territory.
Of course.
Because we're talking 11 counties. We're talking about Ann Arbor. We're talking about like just huge space of land, but up 10 point, up nearly 11%.
I hear the millennial population in Lenawee County is pretty off the hook.
Well, and that gives us in this 11 county region.
But also, I mean, I think anecdotally, we're seeing that there are more millennials in Detroit. I mean, I went back and checked the breakdown by the Census Bureau. The amount of 24 to 34-year-olds living in Detroit was virtually unchanged between 2017 and 2010, which was the last actual census. Every year is like an estimate. But they're a much bigger proportion nowadays of Detroit's overall population, which has fallen, since 2010, which suggests that there are indeed more millennials moving in than other age groups.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're using the official terms to every single age group that they're assigning statistically so that we have everything be even Steven.
Me, I call myself Generation X, man. Whatever.
You're first, yeah. Well, and the other thing I've noticed about that, and this is purely anecdotal, is that our audience is vast majority that age group,
the millennials.
Yeah. And the amount of interest, questions and answers, emails, LinkedIn requests, all that stuff has been off the chain since we started this podcast and only growing. That is the number one group that we hear from, whether it's questions moving in, neighborhoods to go to. And another thing I think that's interesting, and this is going to affect our this affects our coverage now and going forward. A lot of those folks are spreading out across the region. So you got folks going to Ferndale, Madison Heights, Oak Park, Livonia. Like these suburbs are seeing an influx. And in fact, in reality, it's because a lot of people just can't afford, unless you're in the top 5%, you can't afford to live in the city.
Well, sure. And they're all, they're at the age now where they're focused on their careers. They're starting families, thinking about buying houses for those who can afford it, et cetera,
No, for sure.
They're prime advertising demographic, as I mentioned. But I'm just full of them today, aren't I? One other thing I thought was really pretty cool and worth highlighting is the area of patent issuance, like issuing patents. Yeah, which is always, I think, really fascinating. And it's frankly always been an area where Michigan's always been pretty strong, largely because of the auto industry, right? The auto industry files and receives a ton of patents, just historically. But there's been more than a 30% increase in the numbers of U.S. patents granted in the Detroit region over 5 years. That puts Michigan first for 5 and 1 year growth in patents granted, which that's encouraging, right? I mean, we want to encourage more skilled jobs and skilled economic growth. I mean, that's a good reflection of that.
I look at all this data and I go, there's actually a lot of opportunity here. The question is how do we unlock it? So let's take a couple minutes before we let people go. I want to tie this up with a bow a little bit, because I think there's so much we could do here. There's so many more jobs we could grow. There are new business opportunities here because we are underperforming the nation, right? So, and there are lots of like raw materials that are here. What do we think we could do to kind of put us into that top tier status?
Well, I mentioned, and it's a sort of a pet project of ours. I guess we always kind of go to this well, but for good reason. And I think improving transit is one thing. We have to make it easier for people to get to jobs, right? It like close the gaps of the unemployed, get more people who have just kind of like stopped looking for work, of which there are many here, give them easier ways to get to work, right? Like, I mean, there was the famous Cranes piece, Chad Livengood, about how minimum wage workers who work at 12 Oaks and maybe live on the west side of Detroit, how do they get to work given that Novi doesn't provide bus service? I mean, it's things like that, right? We're seeing with the modest improvements that they've made in, both DDOT and SMART has made in bus service.
The fast service is amazing.
The universal bus card, all that stuff, we're seeing results. More people are using the bus. I use the bus all the time. We rode the bus here today from downtown, and it was a pretty full bus.
I think a lot of people in the region, I think a lot of regional elected leaders, because business leaders, I think they see this because they live it, but a lot of elected leaders, I think, have confused the difference between a hand up and a handout. I get philosophically if you're against handouts and that's how you like look at the world. But a lot of the things that the Detroit region is missing are the hands up.
Yeah.
The basic rungs to get yourself out of poverty. A lot of the decisions, a lot of the criticisms I hear are made with a ton of privilege. A ton of people who have no idea what it's like to grow up on like a regular, like on a low income or even middle low income salary, where, or in a situation where, car insurance, as we dived into so deeply, is so expensive that you literally can't afford to own a car.
Yeah.
Like, we need to recalibrate the idea of hand up and hand out. And the more hands up we give, the less hands out that we'll need to pay, whether it's in social support, whether it's in prison costs,
or
all
handing
that
out
stuff.
Giant, tax incentive packages to, Fiat Chrysler for a new factory or Little Caesars Arena or what have you.
Well, and I think we think about scale, we're a big company town and we have been for decades.
Yeah.
But one of the things I've noticed, so living here in the North End, you see a different side of Detroit's story. This is a neighborhood that's on the edge. Some of the stuff is really great. There are all kinds of rehab projects happening around here. There's also a lot of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I've done, kind of like informally talking to folks doing projects, they're starting to import workers from other regions because we don't have the people to fix the houses. Like, so we're training these folks like at these job fairs and all that other stuff to work on the Ambassador Bridge and all this big stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's
which is great,
but there's a huge need for very practical things on a smaller level, whether it's entrepreneurship or fixing homes or all this other stuff that's just not getting met. We need to think about small successes. And when I think about this neighborhood that's turning around, and I've lived in other neighborhoods that have turned around, it's not the big projects.
Yeah, no,
it's people investing their time and money on a small scale over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about Detroit and the region succeeding, we need to enable people to do that. And that's why I think a lot of times we confuse handouts and hand-ups. And we need to philosophically realize that we're in this together. And until we do, we will not succeed.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I'm a huge fan of like the small things that like cities do. Urban planners sort of call it placemaking, which is a very wonky term, but it essentially means like focusing on small things to make a city, like a block, even just like an empty lot, like more inviting and give it a sense of like place and perspective. So anything you can do think about what they did, like 10, 15 years ago now, I guess, with Campus Martius.
Yeah, and people were like, oh, what are you going to do? Put a park there? And then a lot of people are like, what, you'd put a beach in Campus Martius? And it's the most successful thing they've done.
I mean, it's incredible the way that what they've done there has completely revitalized that kind of center core of downtown. Like, it is so vibrant now compared to what it used to be. I mean, Campus Martius was always there. It was always technically sort of a park in terms of like being a sculpture, but it was an island surrounded by like lanes and lanes of fast moving traffic. Like, it was not a nice place, And so, I mean, little things like that, or it could be like little things like little pocket parks or sprucing up the facade of a building, or fixing up the inside of a building. I mean, we need a lot more of those little things. The big ticket things will keep on going, and we need some of that too, but we need a lot of little things too.
It's one of the reasons why, from a education perspective, I was excited to see what's happening with Wayne State. and providing that opportunity to lift another barrier to go to college. The challenge with that is if you've got less than 10% of your students ready to go, we need even more supports from that. And it also bewildered me, some of the board angst against this program, against this idea of free college for Detroiters, because that's exactly what we need to do.
Well, a good example, when we were walking from the bus here, is the place just a block or so south of you here, right? It's an old building.
Yeah, it's an old garage and auto sales place. Yeah.
Yeah, and I pointed it out because I could see lights inside through the windows, and I said, "What? You told me that?"
Yeah. There's millions of there's a few $1 million going into that space there.
From Chase Bank, some fund with J.P. Morgan Chase,
right? And I know that it was very much a piece that was kind of like a puffy kind of make everybody feel good piece that was in 60 Minutes, where Jamie Dimon, the CEO of Chase, and there are real questions about the whole mortgage thing to be asked around that. But Jamie Dimon was literally 3 blocks down the street when he recorded this and walking through that stuff. Now
and this is largely a neighborhood driven thing.
Yes.
Using J.P. Morgan Chase money, but it's still. It's a neighborhood driven thing, and it's going to eventually become kind of like incubator office space. Right?
Yeah.
That's fantastic. What a great thing for this neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, Sven, it was fun diving through all this stuff. If people want more, we will link to all of the data on the website. Would love your thoughts. Send them to us at dailydetroit@gmail.com or hit us up on Twitter at @thedailydetroit. And I hope that this brought some value to you and give you some perspective on where we're really at across Metro Detroit. And that'll do it for today's show. It's the end of the week, so many thanks are in order. There are some people who lend their time and talents on a regular basis. This week, thanks to Cheyenne Serini, Randy Walker, Fletcher Sharp, and of course, Sven Gustafson. Also, thanks to our members who help make this show possible. If you can do it and you find this valuable, please join us in helping push Detroit's conversation forward. It's just a few bucks a month at patreon.com/dailydetroit. And if you have some stuff to promote, we have a new option for that too. Just scroll down there and we'll talk about your thing once a week for the whole month. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.